She thought she played the Mafia boss perfectly. She sleeps in his bed, wears his shirts, and whispers that she loves him when he is asleep. But Damon Volkov just found the envelope. A debt record proving his sweet, innocent maid was planted in his house to destroy him. Now her footsteps are coming up the stairs. What happens when Chicago's most dangerous man realizes his only love is a traitor?
Looking back now, you and I both know that the choices that destroy us usually begin with a simple instinct to help. I was just the maid. He was Damon Volkov, the untouchable king of the Chicago underworld. I remember that night with painful clarity. He stumbled home, his clothes heavy with fresh blood, and locked himself in. Nobody was permitted to cross that threshold. But standing in the chilled hallway, I heard a broken sound and my own name bleeding from his lips. When I nudged that heavy oak door open, I found the most terrifying man in the city completely shattered, begging for me. I should have bolted. I should have faded into the shadows. Instead, I stepped inside and slid the deadbolt shut. The second his empty eyes met mine, I realized my life was over. The cold truth of that night is that I did not step into his room just to patch his wounds. I walked in, knowing I would never truly leave his side again. Life has a funny way of stripping away our illusions when we finally face our darkest desires. For those of you listening to this first chapter of my confession, completely uninterrupted, stay close. This whole tragedy really begins with a cup of coffee I almost dropped. The pale morning light was bleeding through the narrow glass of my bedroom when my alarm buzzed for the second time. I had already been lying awake for 10 long minutes. I kept my eyes shut tight, fighting to steady my breathing and brace my soul before facing another brutal day. 2 Mondays out of every month, my mind played this exact same game. Lying there was my quiet rebellion. It was my desperate way of proving to myself that I still held power over something, even if it was just choosing the exact second my bare feet hit the freezing floorboards. Sometimes, the smallest illusions of control are what keep us from breaking. The red numbers on the clock glared, 5:30. The massive estate was completely silent, save for the armed guards haunting the iron gates and the endless corridors. They never slept. At least, that is the terrifying myth Sloane loved to tell me. I slipped into my stiff black and white uniform, with the mechanical speed of a woman running on pure muscle memory. I twisted my hair up into an unforgiving bun, smoothed the cheap fabric of my skirt, and vanished into the servant hallways. It was the exact same hidden path I had walked like a phantom for 2 long years. The kitchen sat just beyond the heavy service doors. At that brutal hour of the morning, it was the one sanctuary in the compound where we could actually exhale without asking for a monster's permission. It is a strange comfort to find pockets of safety in the shadow of pure danger. Sloane was already there. Her stark white apron was dusted with flour and her dark hair was shoved carelessly up. She stirred a simmering pot of milk while the heavy steel coffee machine hummed its familiar tune. As the head cook for 4 years, she held a quiet power over us, invisible girls. More importantly, she was the single human being in this bleak fortress who could pull a genuine laugh out of my chest. "Good morning, princess," she muttered. She did not even bother turning around, tossing the words over her shoulder like she did every single day. I told her that I was no princess. She scoffed, pointing out that I woke before the sun, made my bed instantly, and ironed my uniform every single night. She joked that if I was not royalty, I had to be a nun. It is a rare gift to have a friend who sees your rigid survival habits as just a quirky personality trait. I felt the ghost of a smile pull at my lips. I reached for the polished silver tray resting on the cold marble, a delicate white cup, saucer, a tiny pot, a sugar bowl, and a spoon. Every piece sat exactly where it belonged. "Has the Pacan called down yet?" I whispered. 20 minutes ago, she answered, telling me he had been trapped in his office since 5. I shifted my gaze to the dripping machine. The dark liquid crawled into the glass pot, pitch black and thick. The bitter, overwhelming aroma washed over the kitchen, slamming into my chest the way it always did. That punishing aroma was my daily alarm bell. His coffee was like his soul. No milk, 0 sugar, and brewed to a violent strength that normal people would choke on. We often shape our deepest habits around the demons we are forced to serve. Sloane grumbled that he woke up earlier than God as she poured the dark sludge. Then she muttered that he stayed in a bad mood longer than the Almighty too. I warned her to keep her voice down, but she brushed it off. She claimed she was only speaking the truth, and if it was a deadly sin, she would be dead by now. I gripped the heavy silver tray with both hands and stepped out into the cavernous main hallway. The priceless Persian rug ate the sound of my footsteps, and the towering walls swallowed my breathing. The Pacan's ruthless men stood like statues in the gloom, one by the clock, another by the west wing, and 2 guarding the top of the stairs. Not a single one of those killers moved a muscle to watch me pass. That was the golden rule of the Volkov compound. You either learned to erase your presence, or you learned the consequences in blood. The greatest defense a powerless person has in a house of predators is simply to become invisible. I had learned my lesson quietly. In 2 agonizing years, no soldier had ever glanced my way twice. The sprawling estate was buried deep in Lake Forest, 40 minutes from downtown Chicago, suffocated by iron gates and dense trees. My tiny room sat far from the wealth, tucked safely out of sight. I avoided the steep servant stairs, choosing the grand marble staircase to safely balance his coffee. Those cold steps bled into an endless hallway, forever bathed in the sickly gold glow of bronze wall lamps that never slept. The heavy mahogany door of Damon Volkov's office stood at the far end of the long hallway, a silent sentinel that always remained tightly shut. She paused in front of it, drawing in a shaky breath to rehearse the script echoing in her mind since 5:30 that morning. "Good morning, sir. Your coffee, just 2 sentences, 4 simple words. You and I both know that sometimes the smallest tasks carry the heaviest weight." It was nothing that demanded more than a steady tone and a lowered gaze. She had repeated it 500 times or more. It never should have been this agonizing. It shouldn't have made her palms slick with cold sweat against the silver pot, or forged that tight knot of anxiety in her stomach. Finally, she raised her trembling hand and knocked twice. His voice drifted through the heavy wood, deep and sharply clipped. "Come in." She turned the knob with her elbow, nudging the door open with her hip. The room revealed itself exactly as it always did. Tall walls devoured by books, a massive dark desk, and a priceless rug beneath her shoes. Damon sat there in a charcoal suit, entirely absorbed in a document. He didn't bother to glance up. "Good morning," she murmured. "Your coffee?" Silence stretched out in response. She began her straight path across the rug, but life often trips us up exactly when we try to walk a perfect line. On her 4th step, her heel snagged the thick fringe. Panic flared as her weight pitched forward wildly. The silver tray tipped in her grip, threatening to send scalding dark coffee splashing over his clothes, his papers, and her fragile world. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the crash. Instead, strong fingers clamped securely around her narrow wrist. The silver tray remained perfectly level. Damon had locked his grip over the thin fabric of her sleeve, steadying her falling frame without causing pain. He hadn't even risen from his leather chair. He merely extended his arm across the desk, moving with an eerie grace, as if he had been patiently waiting for her to stumble. His eyes remained fixed on his papers. "Careful," he murmured. She couldn't force a single word out. True connection always strikes where we are most guarded. His skin radiated an intense heat, far too warm for a man who seemed crafted from pure ice. That unexpected warmth seared right through her sleeve, awakening a quiet, buried ache deep inside her chest that she spent every day trying to ignore. 3 heavy seconds passed. For 3 slow beats, his grip lingered on her wrist. On the 4th second, he finally released her. His gaze remained glued to the printed words. "You can leave it there," he commanded softly. Driven by sheer instinct, she moved like a mechanical doll. She took 3 stiff steps forward, carefully placed the coffee on the polished edge, and retreated. Desperate to conceal her violently trembling hands, she knotted her fingers tightly against her crisp apron. She offered an invisible curtsy to the empty air and hastily turned to escape. That was the exact moment his eyes finally lifted. She didn't see his gaze shift, but her body recognized it instantly. We can always feel the unseen gravity of someone's true focus. It was a dark, heavy stare that struck her squarely between the shoulder blades, leaving a powerful, phantom pressure that refused to fade, even as she finally hurried out through the thick office door. She fled down the sweeping main staircase, refusing to glance back. The lower hallway sat eerily hollow, making the kitchen appear like a desperate sanctuary. Sloane glanced up from a bubbling pot the second she burst through the doors. "You look like you have just seen a ghost," the older woman noted. "I almost dropped his morning coffee," she confessed breathlessly. The wooden spoon suddenly stopped moving. "Almost?" Sloane asked. He caught it. A heavy silence swallowed the warm room. Sloane slowly turned back to the stove, stirring with exaggerated focus. "Princess, if that man caught the tray, it was to save his floor. But if he caught your wrist, that is a completely different story. Sometimes the truths we deny are the ones plainly spoken by our friends." She silently stepped out into the quiet garden, desperate to understand why her skin still carried the phantom burn of his touch 2 hours later. The morning hours dissolved into a familiar, numb routine. She methodically replaced sheets across 3 guest suites, arranged the Closerique's music room, and wiped dust from the towering library shelves. Damon remained securely entombed within his private office. The heavy door stayed shut, and his security men never broke their stoic formation. It is a lonely existence when you build walls so high that no one can ever join you for a simple meal. Around 2 in the afternoon, the stern housekeeper, Mrs. Petrova, commanded her to haul a tall stack of clean towels to the remote western wing. The quickest route was the hidden service corridor. It was a suffocatingly narrow, dimly lit passage with scraping low ceilings, designed entirely for the staff to scurry through the vast manor unseen by the masters of the house. Suspended between the 2 wings, the claustrophobic tunnel was so narrow that passing bodies were forced to press together. She hurried through the gloom, clutching the warm linen to her chest like a fragile shield. The path abruptly hooked into a sharp blind corner haunted by an old wall sconce that perpetually sparked. It was exactly there, in the shadow of the bend, that she nearly collided straight into his solid chest. Damon, he was striding from the opposite darkness. The elite never stepped foot in the servant veins of the house. Yet here he stood, they both froze. Fate always finds a way to force us into a corner when we least expect it. The faulty sconce sputtered weakly, flashed twice in the sudden tension, and died completely. They were plunged into a heavy dusk, illuminated only by a ghostly sliver of pale daylight bleeding from a distant, solitary window. I lifted the stack of towels higher, pressing them to my chest as if simple cotton could shield me from the crushing weight of his presence. He froze. He refused to look at me, keeping his heavy gaze fixed on the wall over my shoulder, as if my face would shatter whatever fragment of control he still had left. I could feel the heat of his breath on my hair, lingering long enough to make one agonizing truth clear. He was not going to touch me, but he desperately wanted to. We stood trapped in that brutal silence. Then, without a single word or a backward glance, he turned and faded into the shadows. You and I know the truth about silence. Sometimes, the most deafening sounds in this life are the words we desperately swallow and never speak. I stood paralyzed, fingers digging into the towels while my heartbeat hammered against my ears. The hallway had turned to ice, or maybe the cold was bleeding out from deep inside my own soul. I dragged myself to the closet, hands shaking so badly that the stacks leaned like broken towers. Mrs. Petrova would definitely scream at me tomorrow, but I truly did not care. I survived the rest of the day as a ghost. I ate a quiet dinner, scrubbed my uniform, and locked myself away by 10. I left my curtains parted to the night sky over Lake Forest, seeking a sliver of beauty to drown out the brick wall in my view. We all learn this hard lesson eventually. Routine is just a quiet ghost we wear to convince ourselves that we are still breathing. I lay there with damp hair on my pillow, fighting a losing war against my own mind. I tried to forget the scorching heat of his hand locked around my wrist. I tried to erase the desperate way his eyes had fallen to my mouth, and the crushing weight of everything he left unspoken. I was drifting towards sleep when the roar of heavy engines shattered the night, and tires tore viciously into the gravel. Multiple vehicles ripped through the service gate, moving with a reckless speed that made my blood run cold. Brakes screamed, heavy doors slammed shut. Then came the brutal, chaotic sounds I had learned to dread during my time at the Volkov estate. We try to lock our doors against the dark, but the bitter truth is that you can never hide from the storms heading straight for your soul. Frantic footsteps echoed below, carrying the heavy rhythm of men lifting something broken. I sat up. The clock read 11:47. A sharp order barked in Russian. Then, slicing through the chaos, came Kirill Sokolov. His voice was terrifyingly precise, demanding one single word in English: "Doctor." The house stopped breathing. I knew someone had come home bleeding. That was the rule he tried to keep. Until the intercom finally screamed at 2:04 in the morning. I was not sleeping. I was just staring at my low ceiling, wide awake in the dark. Time does not heal our deepest wounds. You and I both know that sometimes time is simply the bitter clock that measures the exact moment our quiet world is violently torn apart. I spent 2 agonizing hours with my ear pressed to the cold metal of the air vent. It was the exact same vent that had delivered the word "doctor" into my bones like ice water. I listened to heavy doors slam shut and uneven footsteps pacing the floorboards above me. Muffled Russian voices bled through the walls, too low to understand, yet far too loud to ignore 2 endless hours of listening to a house choking on its own dark secrets. When the intercom finally shrieked, my hand was already waiting on the receiver. "Alina." Kirill cut the silence like a blade. No mercy. Just a blunt order to bring up the big trauma kit immediately. The line went dead. Life is a cruel teacher. We quickly learn that the heaviest burdens we carry are almost always handed to us in the dead of night. This was the private trauma kit for the boss. It held medical gear you could never find in a normal store. I had only touched it once before, back when Kirill suffered a vicious slash to his face from a fight no one ever spoke about. If he needed it tonight, someone was bleeding out. I threw a robe over my shoulders and snatched the secret key hidden behind the kitchen clock. My hands were perfectly steady. A deep part of my soul knew that panicking was a luxury I simply could not afford tonight. I climbed the grand staircase into the dark shadows of the West Wing, spotting an armed guard stationed at the office door. True courage is a strange thing. It is never the absence of fear. It is simply the cold, heavy realization that someone else's survival rests entirely on your own shoulders. Picture the scene with me. A quiet mansion corridor where shadows stretch long under the dim lights. The guard looked right past Alina, treating her like she was completely invisible. Before she could even knock, Kirill filled the office doorway. His voice was low and heavy as he explained the boss refused a hospital. A blade had caught his flank, sinking deep into the muscle. Kirill had been the Pakan's shadow since they were boys. Handing her that trauma kit meant the underground doctor was still miles away, and no one else had the nerve to stitch up a wounded wolf without catching a bullet in return. Kirill nodded toward the bathroom. Alina pushed through the dim office, the single desk lamp throwing heavy shadows, stepping bravely into the unknown. She clutched the trauma kit against her chest, crossing the heavy Persian rug to the bathroom doorway. Damon sat on the edge of the cold marble tub, barefoot and shirtless. His dress pants were stained dark red down the side, the belt still tightly buckled. A ruined towel lay on the floor, and the gash on his flank was an open line about 3 inches long, deep enough to steal the air straight from her lungs. He looked up at her. His face was washed clean, his dark hair slicked back with water. Those ice-gray eyes held a terrifying, absolute calm. Sometimes you realize that the most dangerous men are the quietest ones. To a man like him, a blade to the ribs was just a minor inconvenience, far less annoying than letting a morning cup of coffee grow cold. "Close the door," he commanded softly. Alina obeyed, kneeling on the cold mat to arrange the medical supplies along the edge of the tub. The head housekeeper had taught her the delicate art of stitching skin during her first year. In the ruthless world of the Volkov Syndicate, a maid who could close a wound quietly was incredibly valuable. Damon rested his heavy hands on his knees, his chest rising and falling in a slow rhythm. Up close, the brutal reality of his life was laid bare. She finally saw the wolf tattoo of the Bratva, a dark mark earned only by spilling blood. His skin told a violent story, an old scar on his shoulder, and a thin white line tracing his ribs. She only noticed the hidden wounds when he leaned forward. She took a breath, holding the saline bottle, and warned him that it was going to sting. "I know," he replied. She poured the icy saline directly over the raw wound, yet the man did not even flinch. Only his fingers slowly closed and opened against his knee, the quiet gesture of someone ruthlessly measuring his own self-control. Alina cleaned the brutal cut, applying the numbing agent while feeling the heavy weight of his stare. His unreadable eyes traced her face, then her working hands. She refused to look up. "Who did this?" she whispered, the reckless question escaping before she could stop it. "A man who thought he was going to make it through the night," Damon murmured. "Did he?" she asked. Damon let the dark silence stretch out before simply answering, "No." Alina swallowed the fear in her throat and drove the needle into his skin, keeping her hands steady and true. We often forget how much power a single name holds until someone unexpected speaks it. Her hands remained remarkably steady. 1 loop, 2, 3. Damon sat in silence, enduring the needle like a stone statue. Then, on the 5th stitch, his deep voice filled the room. "You do this very well, Alina." It was the first time he had spoken her name aloud in 2 grueling years. The shock made her pause the needle mid-motion. It was just a brief second, but long enough for him to notice her hesitation. She forced her fingers to keep moving. "Thank you," she whispered softly. "It is not a compliment," he replied. "It is an observation." He stayed perfectly still while she finished the agonizing work, taping the clean white gauze securely over his torn flesh. Alina packed the medical supplies into the kit, thankful her hands were still steady. That was when he moved. Without a single warning, Damon reached out, his large hand wrapping securely around her wrist. It was the exact same wrist he had caught that morning to keep a tray from falling. But this time, his piercing grey eyes were not distracted by syndicate documents. They were locked entirely on hers. She slowly lifted her head, trapped in his dark orbit. The space between them completely evaporated. Kneeling on the mat, her face was mere inches from his bare chest. She could clearly see the steady pulse beating in his neck, the damp hair clinging to his forehead. Then his heavy gaze slowly dropped down to her lips, and in that fragile moment, Alina simply forgot how to breathe. His fingers released her wrist, sliding up to trace the edge of her jaw. In 23 years, no one had touched her with such quiet intent. The word shiver was not just ink on a page anymore. It was tearing through her blood. His mouth drifted closer, an inch, then half an inch. She felt his breath on her lip and the thick heat rolling off his chest. Instinct took over, and she let her eyes fall shut. But then he just stopped. He did not step back. His thumb stayed anchored to her skin, his breath still ghosting over her trembling mouth. You know, looking at them now, it reminds us of a hard truth. The most agonizing moments in our lives are often when the waiting freezes time, teaching us that real intimacy is built in the painful silence just before the fall. Turn the dial down. Let the static fade out. Tonight, you and I are watching a collision in slow motion. Damon stayed perfectly still, just long enough for Alina to open her eyes and meet that heavy, storm-gray gaze. "You don't understand," he told her. His voice was scraped raw. It was the fraying thread of a man who had been bleeding out 2 hours ago, still relearning his own control. "How dangerous it is to get too close to me." Slowly, he pulled his hand away, his thumb tracing a ghost of a touch across her cheek. That fleeting gentleness was the blade that actually cut her. He pushed himself off the cold tub, wincing openly, pressing a towel to his side as he turned his back. "You can go, Alina," he murmured, but she stayed kneeling, paralyzed by the silence. Alina locked her hands onto the medical kit, gripping until the cold metal bit deeply into her palm. She pulled herself up and walked out of the bathroom. Kirill was leaning against the heavy mahogany desk. His dark eyes flicked from her pale face to the door, then back again. He didn't speak. She held the kit to her chest like a fragile shield, drifting like a ghost down the grand staircase. She only let her knees give out when she reached the dim sanctuary of the kitchen. It was past 3 in the morning, but Sloane was there, nursing a mug of tea under the low lights. "Come on," Sloane murmured gently. "Sit down. I'm not asking any questions." Alina sank into the wooden chair, staring blankly at the table. Only then did the violent trembling finally begin. Sloane quietly slid the warm mug across the table, pulling her chair close. She kept her promise of silence, waiting in the shadows until Alina managed a shaky sip. But Sloane's eyes, watching over the rim, said everything. It was the look she gave whenever Alina was lying to herself. The next 2 days dragged on like a slow, dull ache. Alina caught glimpses of Damon in the vast hallways, always from a distance, never once turning his head to acknowledge her. She watched heavy oak doors shut right as she approached. She saw another maid take her usual tray, reassigned without a single word of explanation. The bitter truth settled deep in her chest. She had stepped too close to his wounded soul, and he had built an iron wall to freeze her out. Late on the second afternoon, things began to shift. Mrs. Petrova sent Alina out to the grand front portico for a delivery. It was a massive bouquet of white lilies, bleeding into dark, almost black roses, bound in matte paper and heavy satin. The estate received flowers, constantly, just another cold piece of protocol. Listy signed the slip, dismissed the courier, and turned to go inside. That was when she heard the low, predatory growl of an engine. A sleek, midnight black sedan crawled over the crushed gravel. Stopping short of the stone steps, the heavy door swung open and the air shifted. A woman stepped into the dreary light. She wore a crimson coat that fell past her knees, cinched sharply at the waist. Pitch black heels, an expensive leather bag, and lips painted the exact same dangerous shade of blood red. This woman moved with the terrifying grace of someone who had never once asked for permission to exist. When she spotted Alina gripping those dark flowers, a freezing smile touched her face. "Honey," she purred, her voice thick with a slow, dragging accent. "Aren't you going to help me with the bag?" Alina remained frozen. The woman stopped just below the top step, letting that icy smile linger. "Who am I?" Alina finally asked, her voice remarkably steady. "Zoya Ivanov, guest of the family." Zoya didn't wait for an invitation. She swept up the steps, pulling open the massive front doors, as if she owned the very foundation of the estate. She shoved her heavy leather bag directly into Alina's chest without a glance. "Tell the Pakhan I am here," she commanded, gliding inside. Alina stood perfectly still on the grand portico, a heavy bouquet in one hand and a stranger's expensive leather bag in the other. The biting wind off Lake Forest crept up her legs, but it was the lingering scent of Zoya's perfume that truly chilled her. It settled deep in her lungs, like an omen. That woman in the crimson coat had just crossed the threshold, and Alina had no idea the devastating price they would all pay for her arrival. The next morning brought no comfort. The ground floor breakfast room was tucked into the west wing, a small space bathed in harsh morning light with tall windows overlooking the desolate gardens. Every day at 7:30, breakfast was laid out on gleaming silver trays across a polished mahogany sideboard. Alina had always despised this particular room. The problem with the breakfast room was the exposure. Way too much bright light pouring in, leaving the staff completely defenseless, while the wealthy guests stared at them like breathing furniture. That Friday morning, the glare felt especially unforgiving. Alina walked in at 7:40, balancing a heavy tray of fresh coffee and chilled juice. Zoya Ivanova was already holding court at the table. She wore a sharp black dress, legs elegantly crossed, a thick book lying open that she had no intention of reading. Her dark hair spilled over one bare shoulder, and that venomous red lipstick was flawlessly reapplied, looking like she kept a backup tube just to ensure maximum intimidation. Two other young maids were already trapped in the suffocating gravity of the room. You and I both know the suffocating tension that fills a room right before a strike. Olga and Natasha were huddled by the buffet, nervously rearranging dishes, but the real danger stood by the door. Kirill leaned against the frame, arms loosely crossed, a cup of coffee in his grip. His presence was an alarm bell. Kirill never ended up anywhere by accident. Alina took a breath. "Good morning," she announced softly, placing her tray down. Zoya finally raised her cold eyes from the unread pages. "Good morning, honey. Bring the coffee over here, please." Alina grabbed the silver pot, walked straight into the lion's den, and filled the porcelain cup. Not a single drop spilled. Her hand was steady as stone, a quiet victory in a war she didn't choose. As the dark liquid poured, Zoya's gaze fixed entirely on Alina's fingers. She accepted the delicate cup with both of her flawlessly manicured hands, letting her touch linger on the porcelain just a beat too long. Then, she slowly tilted her chin, flashing that chilling, lifeless smile. "My dear," Zoya announced, pitching her voice loud enough to echo, "you have very young hands to have so many rough calluses. Hands always age before the face when you do heavy labor. The right kind of woman, the kind the Volkovs actually take seriously, are the ones who have never had to wash a single dish." The calculated insult hung in the air, heavy and dripping with venom. Alina swallowed the brutal humiliation, forcing herself to remain completely silent. Over by the heavy wooden door, Kirill stood perfectly motionless, quietly observing. By the buffet, Olga quickly turned to the window, pretending not to hear. Zoya delivered the blow in perfect English, her tone as casual as discussing the morning fog. A hot, prickling flush crept up Alina's neck. The burn didn't come from the cruel words, but from the agonizing reality of a public audience. "Anything else, ma'am?" Alina asked, her voice a hollow void. "No. Honey, thank you." Gathering her shattered pride, Alina grabbed the tray and marched to the exit. Kirill didn't step aside immediately. He stared down at her, raising a single dark brow. Taking a slow sip of his coffee, he murmured softly, "Calluses on a worker's hands are decorations on a castle wall. The wall falls first." He followed her out into the hall. That was the most he had spoken in 2 entire years. To Alina, it felt like a dark prophecy. Back in the kitchen, Sloane was aggressively working a thick mound of dough, elbows dusted in white flour. She took one look at Alina's face, and her expression hardened into pure fury. "What did she do?" Sloane demanded. "She made a comment about my calluses, right in front of Olga, Natasha, and Kirill." Sloane didn't miss a beat. "I am going to spit in her coffee." "Sloane, please," Alina sighed. "I am going to spit so much in her coffee, Alina, I will get the whole staff on a rotation schedule." The absurdity cracked the tension, and Alina let out a breathless, bitter laugh. She slumped onto a stool by the island, grabbing a rough towel. Slowly, she looked down at her palms. There it was, the thick ridge on her thumb, the faded white scar on her index finger from her 3rd month in this cursed house, proof of her survival. Mrs. Petrova had secretly pressed a tin of expensive healing salve into her palm back then, warning her to keep quiet. Workers' hands, damn right they were. These were the battered hands of a girl from the gritty south side of Chicago. The hands that scrubbed strange floors at 17 to keep her little brother in school. The hands that buried her mother at 18. At 21, these same hands clutched a crumpled letter as she walked through the terrifying iron gates of the Volkov estate. People in her neighborhood only whispered that family name in dark corners. She knew exactly what she was signing up for. Someone had warned her that a girl who steps into the Volkov house never leaves it the same way. She marched through those gates anyway, trading her own freedom so she could wire every paycheck straight to Callum. Her brother was 17 now, and he still needed her. When the world tries to crush you, the only thing that keeps you standing is knowing exactly who you take the hits for. The calluses could stay. "Okay, I won't really spit in her drink, Sloane muttered, plunging her fists back into the dough. But I will make her coffee terribly weak, just to see if she complains. Then I'll dramatically quit in front of the Pacan. I'll say, "Sir, I failed your guest standards." It'll be spectacular. Alina threw her head back and laughed, a real, unburdened sound. But the relief was dangerously short-lived. By noon, the grand dining table was set for 5. Consigliere Grigory Rostov claimed the power seat on the right, which was always Damon's spot, and Kirill stood like a grim shadow right behind the Pacan's heavy chair. Zoya boldly installed herself to Damon's left, claiming the space as if it were her absolute birthright. 2 unfamiliar men sat further down, murmuring rapidly in harsh Russian. Alina and Olga moved like ghosts, serving the midday meal. The routine was running quietly until Zoya deliberately tapped her crystal wine glass. She locked her cruel eyes on Alina, projecting her voice in perfect English to slice through the chatter. "Damon, is this the girl you hired to serve coffee? She has such a peculiar way of moving, so delicate, so attentive. It really is a tragedy about her hand situation." Absolute, suffocating silence dropped over the room. Alina was right in the middle of serving the consigliere. Her hand didn't tremble, but the oxygen simply vanished. Behind the Pacan, Kirill shifted his dark gaze from Zoya's smirking mouth directly to Damon's frozen face. "Welcome back to the midnight hour. You and we've both seen how power shows its face, right? It rarely screams." Damon set his silverware down with a deliberate, agonizing slowness. The faint clink against the porcelain echoed like a judge's gavel in that cavernous dining room. He turned to Zoya, his voice a suffocating chill that seemed to turn the very wine in her glass to ice. "Zoya, this woman has worked for me for 2 years. You are a guest out of courtesy. The next time you speak of any maid in my house, you'll be eating breakfast elsewhere. Is that clear?" Zoya gasped like a fish out of water, opening and closing her mouth. I asked if it was clear. "Clear. The lesson here is simple. True authority never needs to raise its voice. It only demands to be heard." "Damon, you know Good," he interrupted, resuming his meal as though the air hadn't just dropped 20 degrees. Across the heavy table, Grigory kept his gaze glued to his plate, but the faint twitch of his mouth betrayed him, the closest that hardened old man ever came to a smile. Beside Alina, Olga finally exhaled a ragged breath she'd been holding. Alina kept serving, her hands impossibly steady, her eyes locked on the polished floor. Deep in her chest, a heart that had been gripped by terror for 3 long days finally settled into a calm, steady beat. Sometimes, finding a sliver of safety in a dangerous room is the only peace we get. As she slipped out of the dining room with her empty tray, Damon finally raised his eyes from his plate. He looked right at her. She didn't dare look back, but the weight of his stare burned into the back of her neck. Perhaps she wasn't quite the invisible ghost she had trained herself to be. She spent her afternoon seeking refuge in the music room, her favorite sanctuary in the sprawling mansion. A grand black piano sat untouched in the center, resting over a midnight blue Persian rug. Nobody ever played it. She would quietly open the lid, wipe the keys, and close it, finding comfort in the quiet care of forgotten things. It's a tragic truth that we often give the most love to the things left behind. Around 7 that evening, the heavy rumble of engines shattered the quiet. 2 cars, then 3. Kirill stormed down the grand staircase, a trio of men in black trailing him. Damon followed right behind. His dark jacket was buttoned tight, his focus locked on some unseen destination. Alina watched from the narrow window of the service wing, tracking the harsh headlights as they sliced across the gravel, and vanished past the iron gates. "Where are they going?" she whispered, unable to look away. Beside her, Sloane sighed. "Somewhere I don't want to know about, you either." We often think ignorance is weakness, but sometimes not knowing is the only shield we have left. She tried to sleep, lying in the dark at 11, but her nervous system remained wide awake. It was nearly 3 in the morning when the cars finally returned. The tires chewed the gravel heavily, sluggishly. A single door slammed violently. Frantic footsteps rushed towards the side entrance. Now, you and I know the feeling of a late-night panic, that sudden chill in the blood. Alina recognized Kirill's harsh bark, ordering men to carry something upstairs. Trembling, she threw her robe over her nightgown, slipping blindly down the dark service stairs. The kitchen was dead silent. Sloane was fast asleep. Alina crept through the shadows, her heartbeat echoing like a drum in her own ears. Reaching the main hall, exactly as the men dragged themselves through, Damon led the pack. He was on his feet, but his posture was brutally crooked. His pristine white shirt was soaked through with blood on the right shoulder, dark and crusted at the top, but wet and viciously bright as it dripped downward. Sometimes curiosity pulls us right into the center of the storm. Damon's eyes were open, yet completely hollow, staring into some hellish place miles away. One bloody hand clamped down hard on his ruined shoulder, the other hanging limp, his fingernails painted crimson. Kirill hovered right behind him, gripping the packhand's elbow to keep him upright, followed by 2 battered guards. Alina shrank back, pressing her spine flat against the cold hallway wall. As Damon staggered past, barely 6 feet away, his head slowly turned. Those freezing grey eyes locked onto hers for one infinite second. She saw the raw agony he was desperately swallowing, and he saw her witness it, yet he never broke stride. The greatest burdens are the ones we refuse to let others carry. He vanished upstairs, and the heavy bedroom door slammed violently shut. Alina stood frozen in the drafty hall, forgetting how to breathe. 2 agonizing minutes later, Kirill descended the stairs, blowing past her while muttering harsh Russian into a static-filled radio. Pausing at the bottom step, he turned half toward her. "Stay in the kitchen," he growled in English, barely glancing her way. "The doctor's on his way. He doesn't want anyone coming up." Kirill vanished out the side door, his tires spinning out into the night. A suffocating silence reclaimed the mansion. Alina drifted back to the kitchen to find Sloane awake, sitting quietly with a glass of water, her hair hurriedly pinned up. Sloane's eyes shifted from the dark hallway back to Alina's pale face. Hurt shoulder. Trouble always leaves an echo, even when the shouting stops. "Bad?" Sloane pressed. "I don't know," Alina murmured. Sloane silently poured a glass of water and pushed it across the table. They sat in heavy, weighted silence until the older woman finally ordered her back to bed. But sleep was a ghost that refused to visit. Alina lay shivering in her ground floor room. Just before 5 in the morning, she heard it. Not a footstep, not a door hinge. It was a dark, strangled noise, bleeding through the metal ventilation duct that linked the servants to the master suites. It was the very vent that had carried the whispers of blood on a previous violent night. A low, guttural groan trapped in a man's throat, followed by a sharp, cut-off gasp. She bolted upright. Pain, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way to speak. She knew the brutal reality of that wound. She had seen the sheer volume of dark blood, and he had locked himself away up there completely alone. The doctor had never arrived. The crunch of gravel would have given him away. If Damon was bleeding out in the dark, she was the only one who knew. Taking action in the face of fear is the clearest measure of who we really are. She sprang from the mattress, snagging the key to the medical cabinet. With trembling hands, she loaded a silver tray, a pitcher of ice water, clean towels, sterile gauze, and sharp-smelling antiseptic. She climbed the pitch-black service stairs entirely from memory. 2 years of silent servitude had taught her every creaking floorboard and hidden shadow. She hugged the heavy tray to her chest and ascended. "Come with me now, down this dimly lit corridor. You can feel the tension in the air, can't you?" The West Wing was bathed in an eerie half-light. The heavy-set guard who usually stood sentry was missing, likely banished the moment his boss staggered upstairs. Alina's soft slippers glided silently over the plush carpet. She crossed the long, haunting stretch to the master bedroom and froze. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar, just a 2-finger gap spilling a sickly yellow slice of lamplight onto the floorboards. That detail alone was terrifying. In the ruthless world of the Volkovs, doors were either securely locked or wide open. There was never a middle ground because a gap meant vulnerability. And vulnerability is exactly what puts men like Damon in the grave. Her mind raced back to the phantom doctor, the car she had strained all night to hear. It hadn't come. Someone else had gone inside. Someone had clumsily patched him up and slipped out without securing the heavy latch. Most likely Kirill, rushing under strict orders to leave the boss alone. The massive doors of the estate required a hard, deliberate push to click shut. Alina took a shaking breath and pressed her ear against the narrow crack. Through the dark wood came a ragged animal sound ground out between clenched teeth. It wasn't the standard groan of physical agony she had learned to recognize over the years. It was something profoundly deeper, a raw, tormented desperation. It shows us that our bodies often recognize true suffering long before our logical minds name it. Every instinct screamed at her to retreat, to flee back to the safety of the kitchen and erase this night from her memory. But human compassion has a tragic way of overriding common sense. She leaned her slender shoulder against the heavy wood, nudging it open inch by terrifying inch, just enough to peek inside. There he was. Damon lay sprawled across the massive bed, bathed in the solitary glow of a low nightstand lamp. His ruined shirt was gone. His tailored grey pants hung dangerously loose, the leather belt completely undone. A fresh square of bloodied gauze was slapped haphazardly over the gunshot wound on his shoulder, already slipping out of place. His head was thrown back against the velvet headboard in utter defeat. His steely eyes squeezed tightly shut against the dark. His chest heaved with ragged, tearing breaths, searching for an escape from the fire in his flesh. The cold, impenetrable mask he wore like armor every day had shattered entirely. His jaw was wired with unbearable tension, lips parted in quiet agony, the trauma of the night carved into the lines of his forehead. He hadn't noticed her in the shadows, but before she could slip away, a sound tore free from his bleeding throat, a raw, unguarded whisper slipping past his defenses. "Alina, it's terrifying how deeply our souls know who we truly need." Shock paralyzed her fingers. The silver tray plummeted. The heavy water pitcher slammed into the carpet, rolling wildly. The box of gauze smacked the bare hardwood, a sharp crack echoing like a gunshot. Damon's icy eyes snapped wide open. Time simply stopped. Stick with me here, because this is the moment everything fractures. Neither of them dared to breathe. He remained frozen in his vulnerable pose, while his piercing grey eyes locked onto the mess, the spilled water, the scattered medical supplies, and the trembling woman clutching her robe at the door. Alina desperately tried to find her words, but sheer terror stole her voice. I didn't see anything, she stammered, the lie slipping out like a fragile thread. Damon didn't twitch a single muscle. You shouldn't lie to me, Alina. His voice wasn't angry. It was a terrifying, hollow rumble. It was the sound of a dangerous man realizing his perfect control was gone, and there was absolutely no hiding his broken pieces from the one soul who had come to mend them. Picture this, friends. It is that defining moment in the dead of night where you either run or ruin yourself. She should have walked right out of that room. She should have dropped that silver tray, bolted down those narrow service stairs, and spent the rest of her life pretending she never pushed that heavy door open. We all have those moments, do we not? Times when our brains scream to flee, but our legs turn to stone. She stood completely frozen. Is that why? She whispered, her voice sounding like a stranger. You have been avoiding me for 3 whole days? Damon closed his tired eyes. When they opened, the cold mask he wore for 2 years was finally gone. Yes, he answered, just one word. For how long? She pressed. 2 years. She closed her eyes. You knew, every single time. Her legs barely held her weight. Then why? Damon tried to shift his weight, the sharp agony visibly tightening his wounded right shoulder. Because a woman close to me is a marked woman. Alina, he told her, because I have already lost people over far less. Because you are the only clean thing left in this brutal house, and I was not going to be the man who ruined that. You do not have the right, she shot back. I know I do not. To decide for me, she pushed, to decide that I am too fragile to know what I truly want. Right there, his iron voice finally broke. It was a subtle fracture, but she heard it. I know, Alina, he confessed. I do not know when it was that I walked. I do not know when my legs decided to move without asking my permission. Sometimes, the heavy heart takes over before the mind even realizes the journey has begun. I only know that suddenly I was inside the room, he said, and the door was closed behind me. My hand turned the key without me even thinking to do it. She crossed the heavy rug, stopping right at the foot of his bed. He looked up at her. The usual pale grey of his eyes had shifted into a dark storm. Alina, he breathed. I came here to help you change the dressing, she stated plainly. Alina. But I did not come up here just to leave again. Damon closed his eyes for another agonizing second. When they opened, he reached his uninjured left hand out to her. He turned his wide palm upward and waited in the heavy silence. Come, he simply said, and she did. Because when someone finally drops their shield and offers you their bare truth, you simply have to meet them halfway. Her hand met his scarred one, and he pulled her close with a gentle care she then never knew a man of his dangerous size could possess. The mattress sank under her weight. Up close, his scent was a warm, metallic blend of fresh blood, dark cologne, and cold sweat. The new scar on his shoulder was still weeping crimson under the gauze. Lower down, the bandage she had applied days ago was holding strong. The neat line of her own stitches remained visible beneath the tape. She found herself recognizing her delicate work on his skin before anything else. He slowly lifted his hand to her face, sliding it through her hair, brushing away the stray strands from her eyes. It is funny how our deepest connections are often forged in the quietest moments of tending to another person's wounds. Are you sure? He asked, his voice lacking a question mark. I am sure. Look at me, Alina. She looked. He told her if she wanted to stop at any moment. She only had to say the word. I do not have control over much tonight, he admitted, but that I do. Tell me you understand. I understand, she whispered. Then he kissed her. It was nothing like the rushed fantasy she had played in her mind for 2 years. It was slow. The deliberate kiss of a man who had waited entirely too long to risk getting it wrong. His warm mouth made her feel incredibly small, yet wonderfully whole all at once. His hand traveled down her neck, finding the satin knot at her waist. He untied it without a single ounce of hurry. True patience, you see, is always the most profound form of devotion. The robe fell open. He slid it off her shoulders like he was peeling away heavy armor she no longer needed. The white slip underneath was thin, a simple maid's garment. Yet he looked at that cheap cotton as if it were spun silk. "You are shaking," he murmured against her mouth. "It is not fear," she breathed. "I know," he replied. He laid her back against the pillows with the care of someone setting down fragile glass. Except she was not broken, and he knew it well. His mouth found the pulse at her throat, tracing her collarbone, discovering spots she never knew existed. Neither of them spoke, only the quiet, honest sounds that slipped into the dark before they could be held. Back, the slip finally came off. Total vulnerability is a beautiful thing when entrusted to the right hands. The sheet grew warm beneath her bare back. He slowly covered her with his frame. It was a flood of weight, heat, and the rough edge of gauze on his wounded shoulder. He deliberately propped himself up on his forearms to shield her. "Are you okay?" he asked with absolute sincerity. "I am okay. I'm going slow," he promised. "I know." And he truly did. He moved with a careful slowness that made her realize why they say the first time permanently marks the soul. There was a brief pain at the beginning. It felt strange, yet intensely warm and full. She held her breath, and he instantly froze. He waited until she exhaled, waiting until his scarred hand found her fingers on the sheets, and they laced tightly together. You and I both know that true strength is simply knowing when to be gentle. Only then did he move again, with a profound care, requiring no words, slipping into a rhythm he allowed her body to dictate. Somewhere between his heavy breaths against her forehead and his eyes meeting hers, the pain blossomed as something different. The strange sensation became deeply hers. She refused to close her eyes, terrified of losing the raw look on his face. "Alina," he whispered, not in the tone of a man demanding something, but a man discovering a miracle. "Damon," she breathed. "Mine," he replied. It was not a dark claim of possession. It was a sacred offering. It was a hardened man, speaking a word he had locked away for years. She let go of his hand, bringing her palms up to cup his bruised face. Love often begins the exact moment we decide to surrender our oldest defenses. He closed his eyes, leaning into the warmth of her palm. In that instant, a wave rose up inside them both. Not an explosion, but a tide that asks no permission from the shore. It surged through their nerves, wiping the sound out of the room, leaving only the echo of their breathing. It left only his weight, her hand cradling his face, and that single word echoing like a vow without a witness. He stayed braced over her for a long while, resting his forehead against hers as his chest rose and fell. His hand remained tightly laced with hers. Neither wanted to let go. When he finally rolled to the side, he pulled her with him. He propped himself up on one elbow just to look at her, his thumb tracing the soft line of her cheek. True shared silence often speaks louder than the grandest confession. "Everything is okay," he murmured. It was not a question, it was an anchor. "It is," she agreed. "You can cry if you want." "I do not want to." Then he smiled. For the first time in 2 years, she saw Damon Volkov genuinely smile. It was just a slight curve at the corner of his mouth, but it was real, and it belonged to her. He pulled her flush against his chest, keeping his wounded shoulder elevated. She pressed her face against his sternum, resting over an old scar, listening. His heart beat in a deep, uneven rhythm. He pulled the sheet over the shoulders and turned off the lamp. "Sleep," he whispered. Are you going to sleep? I am going to try. She closed her eyes, and he never let go of her hand. She woke up just before dawn. Peace is rarely a place we find. It is usually a person we hold. The bedroom light was a melancholic blue, with the early morning brightness creeping in. The sheets were warm. His chest rose and fell in a hypnotic rhythm beneath her cheek. His hand, which had fallen asleep laced with hers, was looser now, relaxed but still touching. She thought about quietly slipping out of bed, sneaking down those cold service stairs before the house woke up. Before Damon opened his eyes and saw her face in the daylight, regretting everything. She had learned too early that men in the morning are rarely the same men they were at midnight. The dark doubt started rising in her chest like nausea. She began to slowly ease her body away from his heat. Instantly, his hand tightened its firm grip on hers. Fear is merely a heavy ghost trying to steal the fragile truth of our mornings. It was a firm anchor. No, he grumbled, his voice thick with sleep, eyes closed. Stay. He pulled her back against his chest, sliding his arm over her waist, keeping the hurt shoulder off the mattress. His body instinctively adjusted to hers, as if that was the only created shape he could ever find rest in. He went right back to sleep, as if she had always belonged there. Chapter 5. Nobody touches what is his. She woke up the second time when the sunlight fully flooded the room. The side of the bed where Damon slept was empty. She sat up slowly, pulling the sheet over her chest, and looked around. His imposing bedroom, bathed in honest daylight, was far less intimidating than under the lamplight. We often build monsters in the dark that the morning sun easily chases away. There was a shirt folded at the foot of the bed. Light blue silk, entirely too big. He deliberately left it for her. She slipped it on, buttoning the fabric from the middle up, bare feet on the rug. His scent was woven into the fibers. Wearing his armor was a profound new weight. She walked out and headed straight down the grand main staircase. She knew she should have taken the service stairs. That is what a maid does when leaving the boss's room. But something deep inside her made an irrevocable decision the night before, and she refused to apologize for it in the daylight. The kitchen smelled of strong coffee and warm bread. Sloane stood by the stove with her back turned, her apron tied over her uniform. Real courage is simply deciding your truth is worth more than their judgment. Sloane turned when the door clicked shut. She looked over her shoulder, turned back to the stove, then looked again. She set her spoon down, turning her entire body. Her shocked eyes traveled from Alina's messy hair to her bare feet. Sloane opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. You are wearing a silk shirt that costs more than my rent, she whispered. A man's shirt, smelling like expensive cologne, and you came down the main staircase, not the service one. Princess. Alina, look at me. Is this what I think it is? Alina took a breath to answer, but she did not need to. Damon Volkov walked into the kitchen through the hallway door. Just like that, the power dynamic of the house shifted. You and I know we can never hide who we love. The truth always walks right into the room. Picture this, you and I. It is a quiet morning that lies through its teeth. Damon steps into the kitchen, white shirt unbuttoned, fresh gauze visible over his right shoulder. Whether he patched the wound himself in the dark, Alina does not know yet. Damon scans her, then moves toward the coffee maker with the slow grace of a man who owns the air he breathes. He grabs a second mug and raises one dark eyebrow at Alina. She gives a silent nod. When he hands her the coffee, his rough knuckles lightly graze her skin. Good morning, he murmurs a low rumble. Good morning, she whispers. He takes a sip, eyes locked onto hers before vanishing through the heavy door. Sloane remains completely frozen by the counter, still clutching a wooden spoon. Intimacy often blooms in the quietest spaces. Sloane stands frozen before letting out a heavy breath. "I need to sit down," she stammers, dropping onto the wooden stool at the kitchen island. For 10 long seconds, the room is completely silent. She finally looks up at Alina with wide eyes. "The coffee was too strong today," Sloane mutters, declaring it her only official comment on the undeniable tension. Alina tries to press, but the cook waves her off. "No, princess," Sloane insists, pointing at her dough. "Milk is going into the bread, and we will only talk about this later, when I have liquor in my hand." Alina lets out a short, fragile laugh, a sound escaping a chest still aching from the night before. It is funny how humor often serves as our only shield when reality gets too heavy. Sloane simply shakes her head, muttering soft curses in Spanish as she turns back to the warm stove. The music room sits hidden at the end of the east wing, a sanctuary anchored by a massive black piano. A dark blue rug covers the floor, intentionally designed to swallow the sound of approaching footsteps. After lunch, Alina grabs a soft dust cloth and slips inside. It is supposed to be another maid's shift, but Alina desperately needs an empty space to breathe. She stands with her back to the entrance, slowly wiping down the glossy surface of the closed piano lid. The heavy wooden door opens without a single sound. There are no footsteps to warn her. Only a thick, unmistakable fragrance invades the quiet air first. It is a heavy, overbearing perfume, carrying far too much bitter lemon and a suffocating wave of amber. Even in our quietest moments of retreat, our troubles always have a cruel way of tracking us down. It is Zoya. Alina feels the cold reality settle in her stomach, yet she refuses to turn around. "Have you ever used the music room?" Zoya asks, her voice low and dangerous from the doorway. "Or do you only clean?" Alina keeps her hands moving, gripping the cloth tight. "I only clean," she replies. "What a shame," Zoya purrs, stepping inside. The sharp click of a designer heel strikes the hardwood before vanishing into the thick rug. Zoya stops right across the piano. "Did you sleep well, honey?" The words drip with poison. It is not a polite question. It is a calculated trap. Zoya had noticed something that morning, perhaps a lingering glance or a closed bedroom door at 8 o'clock. People like Zoya possess a terrifying instinct for uncovering desires. We can try to bury our deepest secrets, but eventually the tension in the air gives us away. Alina finally turns to face her. Zoya stands across the black piano, one perfectly manicured hand resting on the polished lid. She wears tailored black pants and a stark white blouse, her crimson lipstick drawn into a chilling smile. "I slept well, ma'am," Alina says softly. "Thank you." Zoya leans forward. "And him? Did he sleep well?" Alina does not rush to answer. She deliberately folds her dust cloth into exact thirds, laying it gently next to a crystal vase. "You are a guest here, ma'am." Alina replies with quiet strength. "If you have a question about the master's sleep, you should ask him." Zoya's confident smile instantly shatters. "Careful with your tone," she hisses. "I know the kind of woman he uses when the night is long, and the kind he forgets by morning. Jealousy is a bitter poison, slowly consuming the vessel that carries it." Alina holds her gaze, steady and unblinking. "How long are you staying, ma'am?" Alina asks casually. "Just for planning purposes, so I know whether to set the table for 4 or 5. Zoya opens her mouth, stares and snaps it shut in pure shock. In that tense silence, Alina catches a dark movement near the entrance. Damon is standing perfectly still in the doorway, his broad shoulders leaning heavily against the frame, thick arms crossed over his chest. There is no telling how long he has been watching, or how much of the venom he heard. His piercing eyes remain locked entirely on Alina, refusing to wander. He does not say a single word, because true power never really has to announce its presence in a room. Zoya finally turns her head, gasps softly at the sight of him, and rigidly squares her tense shoulders. Zoya frantically tries to summon her cold smile, but her lips tremble. Defeated, she sweeps past the piano, her heavy amber perfume trailing behind her, as she storms out the door without daring to glance at Alina again. She brushes within a mere inch of Damon, but he ignores her entirely. His intense gaze never leaves Alina. Once the hallway is empty, Damon steps inside and shuts the heavy door. He closes the distance in 3 long strides. Reaching out, his rough fingers gently tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "You did not have to handle her alone," he murmurs. "I did," Alina replies softly. "If I could not face her now, I would spend my whole life needing you to protect me." He stays quiet. We must all fight our own battles, for relying solely on another's strength leaves us forever defenseless. Damon stares at her trembling mouth for 1 agonizing second. Slowly, his hand travels downward, lacing his calloused fingers perfectly through hers. He lifts her hand, pressing a tender, lingering kiss right against her knuckles. In that single moment, a terrifying realization crashes over Alina. She is entirely in love with him. It is a profound, silent confession echoing in the depths of her soul. She feels a heavy lock tumble inside her chest, forever altering the shape of her heart. Love rarely announces itself with trumpets. It usually slips in quietly, changing everything. The rest of her afternoon passes in a dreamy blur of chores, but night falls swiftly in November. By 8:30, Alina is carrying fresh towels down the south corridor when she happens to glance out the dark window. The heavy iron service gate sits about 100 feet from the estate, flanked by a small security booth. Normally, that booth shines like a beacon under the night shift's watch. Tonight, it is pitch black. Alina freezes, her fingers gripping the heavy curtain as she pulls it back. The guard is gone. Just beyond the iron bars, 3 dark silhouettes wait perfectly still on the sidewalk. They are dressed in solid black, blending like phantoms into the night. Suddenly, a street lamp catches the metallic glint of a weapon in one man's hand. Cold panic floods her veins. We all experience that terrifying second when normal life fractures into survival. Alina drops the thick towels. Instead of running toward the vulnerable front entrance, she bolts for the hidden service stairs, taking them 2 at a time. Her lungs burn, breath tearing from her chest in desperate gasps as she scrambles up the narrow steps. At the top, the West Wing corridor is bathed in harsh light. Damon's office sits at the far end, shut off from the danger below. Alina pounds her fist against the heavy wood twice. "Come in," his deep voice echoes. She throws the door open. Damon and Kirill are huddled over a sprawling map on the desk. They look up instantly. The security booth. Alina pants, trembling wildly. It is completely dark. 3 men are standing on the street, and they are armed. It takes Damon exactly 1 second to process the threat. You can see the exact moment the tender man vanishes, replaced entirely by the ruthless boss. "Kirill," Damon barks, his voice turning into cold steel. "Primary exit route. Cancel the cars in the south garage." Damon orders, his mind racing. If Morozov took the back booth, his men are already covering the front. Kirill snatches a radio, barking sharp commands in rapid Russian. Damon turns his piercing gaze to Alina. "Go to the kitchen right now," he demands. "I am not hiding," she shoots back, her voice shaking but defiant. "There is a hidden route," she insists. Out the side door, through the vegetable garden cutting straight to the east wall. Your men ignore it because it is just a maid's path. Morozov will not expect it. I walk it every single day. Damon stares at her for a split second, weighing her courage against the terrible risk. Kirill lowers his radio, nodding grimly. She is right, boss. Damon exhales sharply, racks the slide of his handgun, and commands her to lead the way. Stick with me, because this is where everything fractures. They rush down the interior staircase, spilling into the warm kitchen. Sloane stands completely frozen, eyes wide with terror, clutching a serrated bread knife. Kirill points a finger at the thick pantry door. Get inside, lock it, and do not open it for anyone but me, he growls. Sloane does not dare argue. The wooden door slams firmly shut behind her. Alina leads the men down the narrow service corridor in a tight line. Suddenly, the deafening crack of a gunshot echoes from the main hall. It is muffled by the massive walls, but absolutely unmistakable. Then comes another, followed by a violent burst of automatic fire. The front gates have fallen. Keep moving, Damon whispers. They burst out into the freezing night air of the back garden, spotting two loyal shadows waiting by the far east wall. Kirill recognizes their own guards and throws up a quick hand signal. The men sprint toward them through the dark, but tragedy is a beast that loves ambushes. A second group of armed killers storms out from the glass greenhouse. One of the assassins opens fire before he even has a visual. Damon violently shoves Alina behind his massive frame, slamming her safely against the rough brick wall. A stray bullet shatters the stone mere inches from her skull, sending sharp shrapnel slicing into her elbow. Warm blood instantly drips down her shivering arm. Without hesitation, Damon and Kirill return fire. The night air erupts in thunder. 3 enemy bodies hit the frozen dirt in grim unison. A suffocating silence follows, broken only by jagged breathing. Deep inside the grand house, the chaotic, bloody war continues to violently rage on. It is the dead of night, and the gunfire has finally stopped. He spun her around the second the shooting died, his left hand gripping her shoulder with a desperate, crushing weight. His wild eyes scanned her from head to toe, searching for a fatal wound, terrified of finding something worse than the jagged cut on her elbow. "You are hurt," he rasped, his voice tearing at the edges. "It is just a piece of brick," she whispered back. He demanded to know where else, but there was nothing else. His grip tightened, then released, leaving his face pale with the agonizing realization of how close he came to losing her. Over the radio, Kirill delivered the grim news. Arkady Morozov had slipped through the front gate, leaving only the white smoke of burning tires. The man had escaped, but his face was now burned into their memories. Damon did not care about the escaping cars. He took Alina by the face and holding her as if she were made of fragile glass. Fresh, warm blood seeped through the tight gauze on his own shoulder, staining the white fabric, but the pain did not even register in his mind. He pressed his heavy forehead against hers. "I am alive," she breathed quietly, simply because the words were the only truth that mattered. He offered no reply, only the heavy, trembling rhythm of his breath. Let us look at the aftermath, where the real choices begin. At 3 a.m, the harsh yellow light of the chandelier illuminated a shattered world. The grand Persian rug, untouched for years, was soaked in dark, heavy red. A shattered porcelain vase lay scattered near the sweeping staircase, its sharp white shards tangled with delicate blue threads. In the corner, Kirill murmured in heavy Russian, tallying the brutal cost on a battered clipboard. Then came Grigory Rostov, the old consigliere, descending the stairs in a simple robe worn over his nightclothes. His grey hair sat perfectly combed. exactly as it was before the chaos erupted. He carried no weapon. He did not have to. His quiet, unarmed presence told every bleeding guard in that hall that the mansion was still a home. Damon leaned over the round table, the right shoulder of his white shirt painted red where the fresh wound wept. He barked into the telephone, arguing in Russian with a voice screaming back from the other end. Alina sat shivering on the second step of the grand staircase, pressing a clean cotton towel to the stinging gash on her elbow. Sloane stood quietly by her side, having fetched the linen from the pantry without a single wasted question. She simply rested a warm, heavy hand on her trembling back, shielding her from the sight of Damon's men pulling cold sheets over the lifeless bodies in the entryway. The heavy slam of the telephone echoed through the hall. Damon marched across the ruined floor. He did not speak her name. He did not offer a polite word to Sloane. He merely reached out his scarred hand. Alina understood the silent gravity of that gesture. She took his hand, and right there, in front of the hardened soldiers, he pulled her tightly against his chest, his wide left hand spread wide across the fragile line of her back, anchoring her to him. Slowly, his heavy head bowed, resting his mouth against the edge of her temple. It was not a kiss, but a desperate anchor in a storm. His chest rose and fell in heavy, jagged rhythms against hers. The third breath was deep enough to crack ribs. Over his broad shoulder, Kirill traded a loaded glance with the old man, Grigory. The consigliere casually scratched his shoulder, looking away to study the wooden doorframe as if it held the secrets of the universe. Not a single soul spoke. The ruthless Pakan of the Volkov syndicate was holding the housemaid in the middle of a slaughterhouse at 3 a.m. Every man in that room knew exactly what that embrace meant. Morning finally broke. You and I know how the morning after a tragedy feels. The way the world seems too bright for the ghosts you carry. Alina sat in the silent kitchen with Sloane, sleep completely out of reach. Her elbow bore 4 neat stitches tied off by Kirill over the wooden table. It was a cruel irony. This was the same stoic Kirill, whose torn face she had nervously stitched together 2 years prior. Sloane kept the dark coffee pouring. Alina swallowed cup after cup, pretending. The oversized light blue shirt wrapped around her frame did not belong to the dangerous man she had slept beside. Around 8 o'clock, the sound of heels broke the quiet. Zoya descended the stairs, clutching a heavy leather bag. She wore her crimson coat and dark glasses to hide the ruined makeup beneath her eyes. Damon stood waiting like a grim statue in the center of the devastated hall. He wore a sharp, dark suit over a pristine white shirt, his wounded shoulder freshly bound beneath the fabric. From the shadowy edge of the kitchen, Alina and Sloane watched the execution of his judgment. His voice was deathly calm. He told Zoya the car was waiting, her hotel was paid for, and a first-class ticket to Moscow was booked. Zoya desperately tried to interrupt, pleading about what she wanted, but Damon cut her down. The cold truth hung in the air. He knew she had handed the service gate code to the butchers who had stormed his home. He figured it out in under an hour. He gave her a brutal ultimatum: take the flight and fade into absolute obscurity, forgetting his name forever. Or, he told her softly, she could choose to stay and find out exactly what his brutal soldiers did to a traitor inside their own walls. He gave her 30 seconds. Zoya swallowed her pride, adjusted her expensive bag, and walked past him without casting a single glance toward the kitchen. The heavy front door slammed shut. Damon did not turn to watch the ghost leave. His dark eyes cut straight across the ruins of the hall, locking onto Alina. Beside her, Sloane let out a low whistle before turning back to the stove. The older woman muttered that the man was terrifying and told Alina to lock him down and swallow the key. Soon after, Damon retreated to his private study. It was a quiet room on the third floor, lined with dark wood and overlooking the sprawling grounds. Not long after Zoya vanished, Damon called for her. For the first time, Alina climbed the grand main staircase. Knowing her days in the shadows were over, the heavy door stood open. Damon sat behind his desk, stripped of his jacket, the top buttons of his white shirt undone to reveal the bandages beneath. He gestured to the leather chair, waiting until she sat before leaning against the desk edge. His arms crossed defensively over his aching chest. He confessed that he almost lost her in the crossfire. Alina admitted she had not slept a wink. Then the silence broke. She told him about her deepest scars. She explained how losing her father and brother taught her a terrible lesson. She believed that loving someone meant carrying the crushing weight of every choice to keep them breathing. That twisted logic was exactly what had infected his own mind. He confessed that he had planned to send her away that very afternoon. He wanted to buy her a ticket and hide her in a quiet corner of the world where the violent shadow of the Volkov name could never find her. When she tried to speak, he gently asked her to listen. He admitted that she had taken the choice right out of his hands. By pulling him out of that lethal trap, she had saved his life. In that terrifying second, the hardened crime boss unlearned 28 years of brutal conditioning. He realized that true love was not a protective cage. It meant trusting the person you love to bravely choose their own danger. He looked up from the wooden floorboards and let the truth fall from his lips. He simply told her that he loved her. Think about the raw weight of that confession for a man like him. A 34-year-old kingpin offering up a vulnerable word he had buried deep inside his chest. He pushed it out because keeping it in was no longer an option. Alina sat quietly, absorbing the shockwaves. Finally, she bared her own soul. She admitted she had spent her entire existence paralyzed by the terror of making choices, drifting through a hollow survival instead of actually living. Fighting back the night before was her very first real decision, and the terror of it still gripped her bones, she confessed. Her waking nightmare was the fear of him sending her away. Yet, she had walked down the grand stairs anyway, choosing the glorious danger of staying over the quiet, miserable agony of running away forever. The air between them shifted. He closed his dark eyes for a breathless second as her reply pierced the armor he had worn his whole life. She told him she loved him too. Those words dropped into the heavy quiet of the study, anchoring themselves into the wood-like, immovable stones. He closed the distance between them, his scarred hand lifting to cradle the delicate curve of her jaw. He leaned down, capturing her lips in a soft, quiet embrace. It was not the desperate, blood-soaked kiss of the night before, but the steady morning truth of a man's sealing a promise he fully intended to keep. When he slowly pulled away, his rough palm lingered against her warm skin, and he rested his forehead heavily against hers. With a low, rough murmur, he asked if she still planned to work as a maid in his mansion. She answered honestly, admitting she knew no other life. He softly reminded her she never had to lift a finger again, but Alina smiled, a quiet rebellion in her eyes. She confessed that she loved the hum of the kitchen, the warmth of Sloane, and the quiet rhythm of dusting the grand music room. Her only demand was that she would no longer spend her nights in the cramped quarters on the ground floor. A rare, beautiful smile broke across Damon's exhausted face, a treasure she was slowly learning to collect. he promised her that could easily be fixed. The day unfolded in a hushed reverence. Alina poured coffee and smoothed out bed sheets, but the armed men respectfully stepped aside, and no one dared call her the maid. By nightfall, she stepped out onto the wide balcony of his massive master suite. You see, true change never announces itself loudly. By lunchtime, Kirill had quietly emptied out her old room. Every piece of her past, the battered suitcases, the worn books, the framed photograph of little Callum, and her heavy winter coat, were carefully carried up the grand staircase to rest inside the massive closet right beside Damon's. Now, she stood wrapped in another of his oversized shirts, a deep navy blue that smelled of expensive soap and fresh rain. Her bare feet grounded her against the cold wooden planks as she leaned her arms over the dark iron railing. From this high vantage point, she stared out over the endless gardens, past the towering security walls, toward the whispering oak woods that stood proudly between their violent empire and the rest of the ordinary world outside. Listen to the late night breeze, my friends. Picture a biting November chill over Lake Forest, not the wet concrete smell of the city, but the raw scent of fallen leaves. She stood on the balcony. Then came the soft slide of the glass door. He stepped out, barefoot, a heavy grey wool blanket in his hands. He draped it softly over her shoulders, pulling her back against his chest. Warm, immovable, safe. No words were needed in the dark. She gently traced his fingers resting at her waist. For a girl raised in the bitter walk-ups of Chicago, a girl who washed her own mother at 17 and learned to keep one foot out the door, this kind of quiet peace was completely alien. Sometimes we run our whole lives just to find a place to stand still. For 23 years of survival, she never had a real place, a bed to crash in, an address, a temporary key, sure, but a place where her soul could rest, never. Standing there on that balcony, wrapped in his scent and anchored by his heavy breathing, she let herself believe this house was finally a home. He pressed a gentle kiss into her hair, a silent promise. She squeezed his hand, holding on to the dream until morning ripped it apart like a bomb. Life is often like that, isn't it? We get the most comfortable right before the floor falls out from under us. That tragic dawn brings our first chapter to a close, but the story is far from over. I have already finished narrating the second book. For a very small fee, you can step right back into the dark with them. Let us look through his eyes now. He has taken lives for far less. A swapped photograph, a misspelled name on a list, a brief hesitation to follow an order. But all his cold violence could not prepare him for the envelope sitting on his desk. Inside were 3 things: a photo of her mother, a letter from her brother, and a bitter debt record proving the girl, who arrived 2 years ago as a maid, was actually a planted spy. The same girl who wears his shirts and whispers sweet devotions in the dark was sent to ruin him. 7 agonizing minutes pass, and his body remains completely paralyzed. Betrayal from an enemy is expected, but betrayal from the one you love destroys the soul. Her soft footsteps echo on the stairs. The most dangerous man in Chicago is about to break. As I mentioned earlier, that moment is just a small taste of what is waiting for you in the second book. The tragedy runs deep, and the heartbreak is profound. To experience the raw, uncensored journey of their shattered romance, all you need to do is click on the first link waiting for you down in the pinned comment. I will be right there waiting for you on the other side in just a few short seconds. The truth always comes to light eventually, and how we handle the painful fallout teaches us who we really are. Remember, simply click that first link down below in the comments. The completely second book, with absolutely no ads and no interruptions to break the midnight spell, is already there waiting. It is very simple to continue the story with me tonight.